Belgium, one of the most overlooked countries in Europe. Small, quiet, landlocked. Most people only know it for chocolate, waffles, and beer. But here is what nobody tells you. This country is falling apart. Not from war, not from poverty, not from any outside enemy standing at its borders. From the inside, silently, slowly, for nearly 200 years. Right at the center of modern Europe, the country that hosts NATO, that houses the European Union, that world leaders visit every single week, is quietly cracking down the middle. And the crack has a name. Two names, actually. The Flemish and the Walloons. Two peoples, one tiny country, and a conflict so deep, so old, so layered that it has outlasted empires, survived 2 world wars, and brought a modern democracy to its knees. Most of the world has no idea this is even happening, but by the end of this video you will, because this is not just Belgium's story. This is a story about language, power, identity, and the invisible fault lines that exist inside every nation on Earth. Some of them just haven't broken open yet. 1. The country that forgot how to govern itself. Let's start with something that should be impossible. In 2010, Belgium, wealthy, democratic, stable, went 541 days without a government. No prime minister, no cabinet, nobody officially running the country for 541 days. That is not an oversight. That is 1 year, 5 months, and 26 days of complete political paralysis in one of the most strategically important countries in the Western world. Think about that. The country hosting NATO headquarters. The country where EU leaders make decisions that affect 500 million Europeans. That country simply stopped governing itself. And here is the part that makes it truly extraordinary. Nothing collapsed. No chaos. No riots. No economic meltdown. Civil servants kept processing paperwork. Hospitals stayed open. Trains ran on time. Belgium functioned on pure autopilot, while its politicians sat in rooms and refused to agree on anything, because the Flemish and the Walloons could not share power. That single fact tells you everything about how deep this divide runs. This is not a surface-level disagreement about tax rates or immigration policy. This is a fundamental, bone-deep conflict about identity, about who these people are, what language they speak, whose history gets told, and who controls the future of a country they are forced to share. Belgium did not break a world record in 2010 by accident. It broke that record because it has always been two nations pretending to be one, and the pretending is getting harder every single year. 2. A country cut in two. Now picture Belgium clearly. It is smaller than the state of Maryland. You can drive across it in under 2 hours. From the air, it looks like any other small European country, neat, green, unremarkable. But the moment you cross certain invisible lines inside that country, everything changes. The northern half is called Flanders, Dutch-speaking, economically dominant, home to 60% of Belgium's population. Cities like Antwerp, Ghent, and Bruges sit here, world-class ports, medieval architecture, global industry. The southern half is called Wallonia, French-speaking, once the industrial engine of continental Europe, now a region still fighting to rebuild after decades of economic decline. Liège, Charleroi, Namur, proud cities, carrying the weight of a complicated history. Two halves, two languages, two completely different economic realities. And then there is Brussels. Brussels deserves its own conversation, and it will get one, but for now, understand this. Brussels sits entirely inside Flemish territory, geographically surrounded on every side by Dutch-speaking Flanders. And yet the overwhelming majority of Brussels residents speak French. The Flemish look at that and see their land being quietly consumed. The Walloons look at that and see their people, their language, their lifeline. Brussels sits in the middle of all of it, bilingual by law, a battlefield by nature. This three-way tension is not a political accident. It is the inevitable result of forcing two deeply different peoples into one country and drawing the borders around both of them. 3, 2,000 years of division. Here is the part most people get completely wrong. They hear Flemish versus Walloon, and they think modern politics, parliamentary gridlock, budget disputes between neighboring regions. No, that's not the case. This divide is 2,000 years old. When Roman armies first swept through this region in the 1st century BC, they immediately noticed something. The north was different from the south. Fundamentally, stubbornly, unmistakably different. The north was Germanic, tribal, fiercely independent. These were people who did not bend easily to outside rule. Julius Caesar wrote about them personally, calling them the bravest warriors he had encountered anywhere in Gaul. The south was more open, more influenced by Roman culture. The Latin language settled there, evolved there, and over centuries became the ancestor of modern French. Germanic north, Latin south. That ancient divide carved out before Belgium existed, before Europe existed as we know it, is the original crack in the foundation. Everything that came after was built directly on top of it. Then, the Middle Ages arrived, and the north did something the entire world noticed. Flemish cities Bruges and Ghent became two of the wealthiest urban centers on the planet. The international cloth trade turned Bruges into a place so rich it was compared to Venice. Merchants arrived from England, Italy, Germany, the Mediterranean. Its artists, Van Eyck, Bruegel, Rubens, produced masterpieces that still define Western art. And in 1302, Flemish foot soldiers faced the elite French cavalry and destroyed them. That battle became a legend. That legend became an identity. And that identity has never not once gone quiet. 4. Born, broken, the creation of Belgium. Belgium was not born naturally. It was manufactured. In 1830, a revolution broke out. A group of French-speaking elites in Brussels rose up against Dutch rule and declared a brand new independent nation, Belgium. The world recognized it. The borders were drawn. The flag went up. But from the very first day, something was deeply wrong. The new Belgian government made one immediate, devastating decision. French would be the only official language, the language of government, the language of courts, the language of education, the language of the military. There was just one catastrophic problem with that decision. 60% of the population did not speak French. The Flemish, the majority of their own country, were instantly made strangers inside it. A Flemish farmer could not understand his own country's laws. A Flemish worker could not navigate the court system. A Flemish soldier could be tried, convicted, and sentenced to death by a judge speaking a language he had never learned. And nobody in power cared, because power belonged entirely to the French-speaking elite, Walloon industrialists, Brussels aristocrats, people for whom the Flemish were simply background noise peasants whose language was not worth the paper it was printed on. Meanwhile, Wallonia was booming. Coal mines roaring, steel factories running day and night, money flowing north to south. Belgium had a majority people. It just treated them like a minority, and that wound opened on day one, never fully healed. 5. The people who fought for their own language. Imagine fighting for the right to speak your own language, in your own country, where you are the majority. That was the reality of the Flemish for most of the 19th century, and eventually, they fought back. It started quietly. Writers, poets, artists, Flemish intellectuals who refused to let their language die under the weight of French dominance. They published books in Dutch. They wrote plays in Dutch. They demanded that the government recognize that the majority of its own citizens deserved to be heard in their own tongue. This movement had a name, the Flemish movement, and it would reshape Belgium forever. Slowly, painfully, over decades of pressure, small victories came. Dutch was granted limited recognition in Flemish schools, then in Flemish courts, then in local government. But then came World War I, and everything got darker. Flemish soldiers were sent to the front lines in their hundreds of thousands. They fought, they bled, they died in the mud of their own country. and their officers, almost entirely French-speaking, could not speak a single word of Dutch. Commands were given in French. Flemish soldiers who did not understand died following orders they could not comprehend. Entire units went into battle with a communication gap between them and the men leading them. The anger that built from that experience was not political, it was personal. It was grief, it was fury, and it would fuel Flemish nationalism for generations to come. 6. The Great Economic Flip. For most of Belgium's history, Wallonia held all the cards. While the Flemish were fighting just to speak their own language, Wallonia was sitting on one of the greatest industrial fortunes in European history: coal, steel, glass, weapons, manufacturing. By the mid-19th century, Wallonia was one of the most industrialized regions on the entire continent, second only to Britain. Factories ran around the clock. The mines employed hundreds of thousands. Walloon businessmen were among the wealthiest people in Europe. Flanders, by contrast, was largely rural, agricultural, poor. The economic gap between North and South was enormous, and the French-speaking elite made sure everyone knew it. Then, the 20th century arrived, and everything flipped. After World War II, the global economy shifted. Coal lost its dominance. Steel markets collapsed. One by one, the great Walloon factories fell silent. The mines closed. The jobs disappeared. Entire cities that had once roared with industrial power went quiet almost overnight. Wallonia became a rust belt. Meanwhile, Flanders was transforming itself completely. Foreign investment poured in. The port of Antwerp expanded into one of Europe's busiest trade hubs. Chemical industries, technology companies, and international logistics firms planted roots across the region. Flanders did not just recover, it surged. And here is where the story turns truly bitter. Belgium's tax system meant that wealthy Flanders was now sending billions of euros every single year directly to struggling Wallonia. The Flemish were paying, the Walloons were receiving, and the resentment that created still burns today. 7. The language wars. Most conflicts are fought with weapons. This one was fought with words. After decades of industrial dominance, Wallonia had built something beyond factories and coal mines. It had built cultural power. French was not just a language in Belgium, it was a status symbol. Speaking French meant you were educated, sophisticated, important. Speaking Dutch meant the opposite. For generations, Flemish parents encouraged their children to learn French not out of love for the language, but out of pure survival. French was the language of opportunity. Dutch was the language of poverty. But as Flanders grew economically stronger, something shifted in the Flemish soul. They stopped apologizing for who they were. Language laws became the new battlefield. The Flemish demanded that every single region of Belgium operate exclusively in its own language. Flemish territory, Dutch only. Walloon territory, French only. No exceptions. No compromises. And then came the flashpoint that nearly broke everything. The Brussels suburbs. As Brussels expanded outward into surrounding Flemish towns, French-speaking residents moved into those towns and immediately demanded French language services, French schools, French road signs inside Dutch-speaking territory. The Flemish response was volcanic. Mayors refused. Town councils refused. Entire municipalities dug in and said not here, not 1 inch. What looked to outsiders like a petty argument about road signs was actually something much bigger. It was a battle over whether Flanders would survive as a distinct cultural territory or slowly be swallowed by French, one suburb at a time. 8. The day Belgium stopped. Everything we have covered so far, the ancient divide, the economic flip, the language wars, all of it poured into one single political explosion. 2010. Belgium held federal elections in June of that year. The results produced a parliament so deeply split between Flemish and Walloon parties that forming a coalition government became virtually impossible. The Flemish parties wanted more autonomy, more regional control, less federal power, and a restructuring of how Belgium's finances worked. They were tired of subsidizing Wallonia and wanted the regions to stand more independently on their own feet. The Walloon parties refused. A weaker federal government meant less financial support for Wallonia. For them, Belgian unity was not just a political preference, it was an economic lifeline. Neither side moved. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. International media started paying attention. Political scientists started using Belgium as a case study for democratic failure. And still nothing. 541 days later, a government was finally formed. The crisis ended not because the two sides genuinely agreed, but because the pressure of governing a country had simply become too great to ignore any longer. But here is what that crisis revealed to the entire world. Belgium's political system was not just dysfunctional. It was fundamentally designed around a conflict that had never been resolved. The 541 days was not an accident. It was not a glitch. It was the system working exactly as the division had always intended it to. 9. Two cultures. One country. Step away from the politics for a moment. Because underneath all the conflict, the economic rivalry, and the language wars, there are two genuinely remarkable peoples worth knowing. The Flemish are a culture that built itself from the ground up twice. First in the medieval golden age of Bruges and Ghent, then again in the post-war economic transformation of the 20th century. Their identity runs deep-rooted in art, architecture, cycling, beer culture, and a stubborn refusal to be diminished by anyone. Walk through Bruges today, and you are walking through one of the best-preserved medieval cities on earth. The canals, the guild houses, the quiet dignity of a people who know exactly who they are. The Walloons carry a different kind of pride, shaped by French culture, working-class resilience, and a rich tradition of music, carnival, and literature. René Magritte, the surrealist painter whose work still baffles and fascinates the world, was Walloon. Jacques Brel, one of the greatest French-language songwriters who ever lived, came from Brussels with deep Walloon roots. The Walloon language itself, a distinct Romance tongue separate from French, is nearly extinct today. But the communities fighting to keep it alive are fighting for something real, an identity that predates Belgium itself. And here is the beautiful contradiction at the heart of this country. Put a Flemish person and a Walloon person in the same room during a Belgium football match, and they will cheer for the exact same team like nothing ever divided them. 10. Will Belgium survive? This is the question every political scientist, every historian, and every Belgian citizen has been asking for decades, and nobody has a clean answer. The forces pulling Belgium apart have never been stronger. Flemish nationalist parties are not fringe movements anymore. The new Flemish Alliance, the N-VA, became the single largest party in Belgian federal politics. Their position is clear. Flanders should govern itself. The Belgian federal structure is broken beyond repair, and the only honest solution is to dismantle it. Behind them stands Vlaams Belang, even more radical, even more explicit. Full Flemish independence, full separation, no negotiation. Together, these two parties represent the majority of Flemish voters. That is not a protest vote. That is a mandate. On the Walloon side, the calculation is equally stark. An independent Wallonia without Flemish tax transfers would face an immediate and severe economic crisis. Brussels, which neither side can agree belongs to anyone, would become an international dispute overnight. And then there is the question nobody wants to answer. What happens to the national debt? Belgium carries one of the highest public debt levels in Europe. Who inherits it after a split? How is it divided? By population? By GDP? Nobody agrees. The honest truth is this. A formal split of Belgium would be one of the most legally, financially, and politically complicated events in modern European history, which is exactly why it has not happened yet. But the pressure keeps building. Conclusion. The warning nobody is listening to. Belgium is a small country, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss as a quirky European story about language disputes and political deadlocks. But look closer, and Belgium becomes something far more important. Belgium is a warning, proof that a country can be wealthy, democratic, peaceful, and modern, and still tear itself apart from the inside. Proof that language is not just communication. It is identity. It is power. It is the difference between belonging and exclusion. The Flemish and the Walloons have been making it work barely, messily, imperfectly, for nearly 200 years. Two deeply different peoples, bound together by borders drawn by history rather than choice, finding just enough common ground to keep the whole structure standing. But the structure is under more strain today than it has ever been. And the rest of the world, full of its own divided nations, its own fault lines, its own majority and minority tensions, would do well to pay attention. Because what Belgium is wrestling with is not unique to Belgium. It is the central question of our time. Can people who see the world differently, who speak differently, live differently, and want completely different futures truly share a country? Belgium has been trying to answer that for 2 centuries. It is still trying. And we will be watching every step of it right here, on this channel. Subscribe, hit the bell, and don't go anywhere, because the next story is even bigger.